Thanks, Bennett. Well, in some state news at the Capitol this morning, Governor John Bel Edwards delivered his final budget presentation before lawmakers. The proposed budget totals $45.7 million, working off of a $726 million surplus, a stark contrast to his first budget 7 years ago, where he entered office facing a substantial deficit. In education, Edwards laid out requests for increasing K-12 public school teacher pay by up to $3,000 with an improved revenue forecast. Now, that would bring teacher pay in the state close to the southern average, which was a campaign promise of Edwards. He wants to see pay increases in higher education positions as well, plus keep TOPS fully funded. He also proposed $52 million toward offsetting the $200 million that will be lost in early childhood education when federal money runs out this year. And in public safety, Edwards wants to see $23 million go toward increases in local law enforcement pay. Edwards wants it to be a permanent increase, not just a one-time bonus. But lawmakers question whether the state can afford the ongoing expense. And in infrastructure, he wants to see $340 million go toward the transportation department to match with federal infrastructure dollars, but doesn't propose what projects that money should go toward. Notably, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Department of Children and Family Services did not receive substantial funding requests. Edwards proposes $12.5 million to DCFS for vacant positions. And of course, these are only a few other proposals in that budget presentation. You can find the full executive budget proposal on the Department of Administration's website.